Welcome to flow number 3. Thank you so much for listening. I just invite you to take a breath with me. Thank you. That just helps ground us in the present. Flow number 3. Well, I graduated from Rice University in 1992. And just after graduation, I had landed a production assistant job with CNN in New York City at the Democratic National Convention, following the advice of my mentor, Lloyd Ramdas, when I had the news internship at Fox Television, who had encouraged me strongly to work both the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention in 1992, as it was an election year, because it would be a great opportunity for me to network with news directors from across the country to try and land my first reporter, producer, and anchor job. And while I had been an intern at Fox Television, I developed newsreels that I was able to share with several news directors. And I need to share a story of what happened at the 1992 Democratic National Convention. It was a moment in time that changed the course of my life. I grew up in New York City. I knew nothing about Indian country. All I learned was literally nothing about reservations, nothing about treaty rights. And I strongly, strongly believe that our national education curriculum needs to integrate our Native American history and understanding of tribes across America. So, out of my ignorance, I asked a very, very ignorant, non-Native question. There was a man standing there waiting to be interviewed at CNN, and he had long braids and was clearly a Native American man. And I walked up to him as he looked upset, and he said that CNN had canceled his interview, and he was an Oregon delegate, and they hadn't called him to cancel the interview. And here I was, a young production assistant. I couldn't believe that they had done that. I went to the producer and said, "Can we please apologize?" And I asked him his name and where he was from, and his name was Antone Minthorn, and he was the General Council Chairman of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Pendleton, Oregon. And in my moment of ignorance, I said, "Oh my gosh, are you Native American? Do you live in a teepee?" I had no idea about Indian country, nothing. And here I had gone to, one of the greatest private schools in New York City. And he folded his arms and he started laughing, and he handed me his card. He said, "No, I don't live in a teepee, but you are welcome to come visit me on the Umatilla Indian Reservation to learn about Indian country." Well, I put this card away, and then I headed to Texas, and I worked for, and by the way, the Democratic National Convention at Madison Square Garden was absolutely phenomenal experience. I was running scripts to the anchors. I was meeting different politicians and dignitaries, and it was truly an amazing, and news directors. Shortly after, I landed a job with NBC Television as a production assistant, and I flew to Houston, Texas, that August for the Republican National Convention in Houston, Texas, where I met Jerry Johnson, who was the news director at Case KVET Country Radio. And I shared the reels that I had created with my mentor at Fox Television. And he offered me my first reporter, producer, anchor job, along with hosting and producing the Austin Sunday Spectrum. And I ended up moving to, by the way, at the Republican National Convention, it was absolutely fantastic. I got to meet Robert Downey Jr. when he was doing a documentary there, and I got to hear B.B. King, and I met many, many news directors, but Jerry Johnson gave me my break. So I packed up my Toyota Corolla, and I ended up at Case Cavet Country Radio, and I drove a little car with a blue siren on it, which I never used. And I covered the state capitol when Governor Ann Richards was governor, and had my own public affairs show. And one day I was interviewing an incredible woman named Genevieve Vaughn, who was the founder of the Foundation for a Compassionate Society. And I was sharing how I had had this invitation out to the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And she handed me $1,000 check and said, go follow your heart and go out to that reservation. Well, shortly before, when I was in New York City, I had ran into a dear friend at a diner on 79th and Broadway who had given me Charles Kuralt's book, On the Road. And he quickly became my favorite writer and journalist because he gave a voice to the America that wasn't heard. And I was already starting to feel constriction being in hard news. I was feeling just, there was so much negativity in the hard news. So I read this book, and let me stay on this thread here. So I briefly went out to the Umatilla Indian Reservation and called Anto Minthorn. He said, you can stay at my brother Doug's house. And Sarah Minthorn met me, Doug's daughter, and gave me my first tour of the reservation. And Doug invited me to come back to stay longer because I was in search of a story like Charles Kuralt had done, of a story from rural America that hadn't been heard. And I got to take a breath here because it's such a big story. I went back to Austin, Texas, and I was selling my stories to the Texas Associated Press Radio in Dallas, Texas. And I got hired by an amazing woman named Amanda Barnett as a summer vacation reporter, producer, and anchor with Texas Associated Press Radio. And when the summer wrapped up, that was incredible. I got to go live 8 times a day, working with just phenomenal journalists, working under tight deadlines, and being a reporter, producer, and anchor for Texas Associated Press was absolutely an incredible experience. And I was in my early 20s. But this invitation to return to the reservation was truly pulling at me and haunting me. And I wrote a letter to Charles Kuralt at CBS News, and he invited me. And I said I was torn. I said, I have this incredible job with Texas Associated Press Radio. I could probably stay on with the AP, but I have this invitation to visit rural America on this Umatilla Indian Reservation. And Charles Kuralt said, come have lunch with me at CBS in New York City. So, oh my gosh, I flew to New York City. I had lunch with Charles Kuralt, who had written On the Road and given so many stories of voice from rural America for many years with his show On the Road. And he looked at me, he said, I was just so compelled to invite you, to tell you in person, to follow your heart. And if you're feeling called to go to the Umatilla Indian Reservation, then take the leap. So I went back and I put my notice in at Texas Associated Press Radio. A dear friend flew out, and we road tripped, packed up my 1981 Toyota Corolla, and I moved to the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and Doug Minthorn graciously opened his home. And I worked locally at a radio station in Pendleton briefly. And then my whole life changed. I was walking on the country road. I had given up all my suits, and here I was on the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Pendleton, Oregon. And I felt called. I was really wanting to live in a small rural town, and I'd grown up in New York City and was looking at Taos and Flagstaff and just smaller town living. But meeting Anto Minthorn changed my life and took my journey to Pendleton, Oregon. So one day I was walking on a country road, and a scruffy res dog, later found out his name was Muttley, kept walking with me. And I looked like a hippie that missed the van by a generation. I'd thrown out all my suits. I was working at the local radio station when I first got to Pendleton, Oregon. And I met Cedric Wildbill at a mailbox on the country road. And it turned out Cedric was home. He was working for Boeing as a media specialist. So you had two media people meeting at a mailbox on a country road. We became great friends. He was hiding his badge from me. He said, "Oh, I heard about you. You're coming out here to make a documentary." And he looked at me and said, "You know how to shoot a camera?" I said, "No, I just know radio work." He said, "Well, good luck with that documentary." Well, we became great friends. And I want to backtrack and let you know that I, ever since high school, had wanted to go to Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. When I was at Associated Press, I applied. I did not get in the first time. Then I spent the next year reading Time magazine and studying really hard. And I got into Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism the second time that I applied, after I left my job and said that I was looking for a rural story, and went out to the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So I took the Greyhound bus. I sold my car and I took the Greyhound bus across America from Oregon back to New York City, where I did my master's in journalism at Columbia University. I am going to close the flow right here because what comes next is an amazing, amazing story.